Hi, this is John Linebaugh from John Linebaugh Tutoring, and this is AP US History Video 35, Two-Party System Part 2, the Democrats and the Whigs. If you like this video, please hit the like button and share and subscribe. Let's get going. There were two new parties in the 1830s, the Democrats and the Whigs. Issues in the 1830s broke the unity of the era of good feelings, so President Andrew Jackson's branch of the Democratic Republicans became the Democrats. In 1833, the Democrats' opponents, led by Henry Clay, became the Whigs. As mentioned in the last video, the U.S. has always had two major parties, except during the era of good feelings, which ended here in the 1830s. Jacksonian Democracy. Andrew Jackson was very oriented towards the common man. Jackson and his followers were angry with the results of the election of 1824. They claimed John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay had reached a corrupt bargain. Jacksonians portrayed John Quincy Adams and followers as elitist, that is, too far removed from the common person to be good leaders, so they were more interested in the rich and powerful rather than helping the common person get ahead in life. Adams and his followers portrayed Jackson as a crude man with a bad temper. Jackson's frontiersman/backwoods/populist appeal got him elected. So I guess the backwoods, crude frontiers backwoods people won that election that got Jackson elected. Jackson's term of office from 1829 to 1837 is called the Age of Jackson. Makes sense, right? Jackson and states' rights. While Jackson supported Georgia in Worcester versus Georgia, that's the case where the Supreme Court supported the federal government in ruling that Georgia couldn't license its citizens to live on Cherokee land. Meaning, if you wanted to live on Cherokee land and you were a citizen of the state of Georgia, you had to get a special license to be able to do that. So, basically they ruled that, no. Native tribes, their nations are sovereign, even though they're dependent nations, so they're foreign countries, so only the federal government has the right to negotiate or have a foreign policy towards foreign nations, not individual states. And this is in video 34, so you can click on that link. But when president, Jackson supported a federal tariff policy against challenges by John C. Calhoun. Jackson's farewell address sums up his political thought. There is a link to the original text of that farewell address in the description, and I'm going to summarize it here. Here's a summary of Jackson's farewell address. First point that he makes is, I've served the public for a long time, but now I'm old, sick, and I must retire. So I want to thank you for being kind to me and give you some advice. Typical kind of retirement speech, so saying, all right, I've had a great time serving, but now it's time for me to go retire. Point number 2. The country has made it through roughly 50 years of war and peace, including the effects of European wars on commerce. The U.S. government has secured peace, liberty, property, and a strong economy, and has succeeded more than any other country in history. I'd say that's hyperbole. It's exaggeration used to make a point. 3. The states and the natives have both profited from the natives being removed from the states. The states no longer have backwards native people impeding progress. The federal government, through reservations, will care for and civilize these people who were headed for self-destruction. Okay, that's unbelievably racist. This is totally not my point of view, but we're talking about Andrew Jackson in 1837, and he was responsible for the Trail of Tears, where they relocated native tribes from the parts of the country they were in towards places out west and kind of in barren lands that really weren't very good. So Andrew Jackson is arguing that the Trail of Tears was a good thing, basically, that, oh, we're taking care of these savage people who can't take care of themselves and will destroy themselves. And it's great because it also gets them out of the way of progress in the states that used to be these people's land. All right, very self-serving, but what are you going to do? It's a political speech. The guy's going to only say good things about the things that he did. And point number 4, we now have peace with all but one foreign nation, and claims by U.S. citizens against foreign powers have been resolved. Remember, there were problems from the War of 1812 and going back to the Revolutionary War with Great Britain and France, etc., where ships and even sailors and goods being traded were seized as contraband, etc., by Britain and France, and probably other problems that I can't think of right now. But anyway, there were definitely many, many problems with European powers and other powers that came up. Well, there were even problems with Libya and things like that, like the Marine battle hymn, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. So there were even problems with Mexico and Libya. But he's saying, okay, right now we're essentially at peace, so that's a great thing. 5. Regionalism and sectionalism cannot be allowed to divide the nation. Goodwill and national unity at the personal level must bind the nation together as one. The federal government can't force unity. So what he's really saying is one region or section cannot be allowed to use the federal government to exploit other regions or sections, since all regions are entitled to justice, or as it says on the Supreme Court building, equal justice under law. Many people have criticized that statement as saying, well, equal justice should just be called justice, because if it's not equal, it's not justice. If somebody's being treated more fairly than another one, that's not really justice now, is it? Anyway, number 6, therefore, states' rights are important as individual states know what's best for themselves. And that's why I have this plaque with the 10th Amendment here. This picture of this plaque says, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So the whole idea is if it's not something that's given to the federal government by the Constitution, then it's something that should be given to the states, assuming it's not prohibited to the states. And then if the states can have it, they can either use it or they can just let the people decide about that right. Makes sense. Is if a power is not explicitly reserved for the federal government, then the states should be able to do it unless it's specifically banned for the states, in which case they're probably saying nobody should be able to have that right. Okay, makes sense. So we don't want to give the feds a ton of power if we don't have to. And that leads us to point number 7. Allowing the federal government to overstep its constitutional limits for whatever reason inevitably gives the feds absolute power. As Lord Acton said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Therefore, the enforcement of constitutional limits is vitally important unless you want a dictatorial federal government. Point number 8. Taxes are important, but U.S. consumers always pay tariffs in the form of higher prices, so government taxation must be limited to necessary and authorized purposes. Has to be constitutional and should be something that's actually necessary government spending. So this is really not much, really not at all different from today's anti-tax rhetoric. If someone's arguing against taxes, it's always, this is unnecessary, wasteful government spending, and this is not even authorized by the Constitution. So that's what we're always looking at. And that's when you have things like the TEA, Tax Enough Already Party, that's from about 10 years ago. They had their heyday. And of course, it's riffing on the Boston Tea Party. And here's another one, Give Blood, Pay Taxes. So what they're saying here is taxes must be reduced when revenues exceed legitimate need. To do otherwise is oppression. Number 9, we have recently overcome such a scheme of excessive taxation, which was purportedly for internal improvements, roads, bridges, dams, canals, etc., that were actually meant to buy votes. So in other words, yeah, it's internal improvements, but there's a lot of waste and graft and corruption, and maybe the improvements themselves weren't really all that necessary. But hey, it's a lot of pork barrel spending in certain districts that are controlled by politicians who we like. So, presumably, this scheme was defeated by putting Jackson and the Democrats in power to reduce the taxes. And point number 10. Through careful tax and spending cuts, the U.S. has retired debts, run a budget and treasury surplus, and lowered tariffs. So, he's achieved the thing that financial conservatives promise all the time, is we can cut taxes, and by cutting spending, we can still have a budget surplus and a treasury surplus and lower taxes overall and blah, 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 simply by cutting spending. So, looks like he actually managed to do that. Or at least he said he did. The feds must always avoid large surpluses since they encourage corruption, and tax surpluses are always being spent on something important rather than being returned to the taxpayers. Notice that I put the important in quotes. It means they say it's important, whoever's going to say, oh, no, 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 we can't cut taxes and we can't actually give you a refund of the money that you paid in taxes because, hey, we have this other super important thing to spend money on. A lot of times it's what they call boondoggle or pork barrel spending, which means we're going to spend it on something we don't really need, but hey, it's going to produce jobs in my congressional district or the congressional districts of my friends who I want to support. So, number 12, hard currency is necessary because paper currency is based upon only public confidence in the value of the paper, can be counterfeited, etc. So here we see Andrew Jackson's picture on a $20 bill. In that case, the only thing that's backing this $20 bill, assuming it was printed after about 1970, is just the good faith in the U.S. federal government, that the U.S. federal government will actually back this banknote. And he also argued that paper currency encourages speculation by banks and people earning livings by investment and kind of gambling on the stock market, rather than actually producing something like growing crops or producing something in a factory. So he also argued that the societal costs of corruption, counterfeit notes, currency devaluation, etc. are often foisted off on working class people. What I mean by currency devaluation is if I have a certain amount of goodwill, or even, especially if I have actual gold backing it up, which we don't today, but we did before 1970. If I print 10 million $20 bills, okay, you just split the gold reserves or whatever the value of our goodwill is, and it's that much. If I print 100 million of it, oh, okay, well, wait a minute. I used to have 10 million, now I have 100 million. So presumably you're going to dilute the value by a factor of 10. Because now you have 10 times as much money as you used to, or 10 times as many paper $20 bills. So that's why I really liked it when I found this while I was researching this PowerPoint. Irony is Andrew Jackson on a central bank note, because he was against central banks. Remember from the previous videos, he was against the second bank of the United States and destroyed it, and obviously didn't like paper money. He really only liked specie, or hard currency, basically actual gold and silver coins. So yes, it's definitely ironic that Andrew Jackson is on the $20 bill. Just like it's ironic there's a Ronald Reagan federal building in Washington, D.C. He was against federal government and wanted smaller government. So what do? They build a building with his name on it. Anyway, let's move on. Point 13, Lucky 13. Furthermore, paper currency controlled by a central bank, that is the second bank of the United States, encourages monopolies, creating a financial juggernaut, of moneyed corporations opposed to the interests of the agricultural, the mechanical, and the laboring classes, which are unable to combat an organized financial monopoly. So if you remember the movie 2001, kind of these proto-ape men, cavemen find this mysterious monolith. And then, so here we have people finding this monolith, and somebody put the Bank of America logo on it. Ha ha ha. Basically symbolizing this whole massive financial juggernaut that's everywhere, even out in the middle of this green field. Anyway, so now we can see that, yes, naming, or not naming, but putting Jackson's likeness and name on the $20 bill is very ironic, since it was paper currency controlled by a central bank, which he said in his farewell address was horrible for the economy, encouraged exactly the wrong kind of economic growth, etc. And 14, he said, we need a strong navy to protect commercial shipping and make other countries afraid to attack the United States. We shall more certainly preserve peace when it is well understood that we are prepared for war. It is a good idea to read the whole address. Go to the link in the description below, but this summary should do if you don't want to. And thanks for sitting through that. The Tariff of Abominations. So the tariff rates were very controversial in the early United States. As it said in McCulloch versus Maryland, 1819, John Marshall quoted in his opinion, the power to tax is the power to destroy, which was his paraphrase of Daniel Webster's argument in that case, which was an unlimited power to tax involves necessarily a power to destroy. So I guess it wasn't an exact quote, it was a paraphrase of Daniel Webster's argument by John Marshall. But that's an important thing to remember. The power to tax is the power to destroy. If I make something so expensive by taxing it that no one can afford it, I've just put that industry out of business. If cigarettes cost $500 for a pack of 20 cigarettes, nobody but the ultra-rich would smoke, and basically nobody would make cigarettes because nobody could make money selling cigarettes. Tariff of 1828 was derided as the Tariff of Abominations. It was put down. It was made fun of. Basically, because it raised taxes on many items, both imports and exports, and reduced trade with Europe. South Carolina was particularly affected as it relied on cotton exports. And so this thing basically reduced the amount of trade going on. And by the way, an abomination is defined as follows. As it says here in this quote from holybiblesays.org, in some cases the word is used to show the attitude of some people towards gods and God's people. In other words, to worship God, to serve God, or believe in God is an abomination to them. It stinks to them. But the important one here is, in the truest sense, abomination is used mostly to show how God and his holiness and certain sins or sinful things stink in the nostrils of God. So remember that we're talking about 1828. That's really what they would have been talking about, is you're calling something an abomination. It is something that actually stinks in the nostrils of God. So great use of hyperbole there. I'm not sure God would actually say that a tax stinks in his very nostrils, but who knows? And you can also see the description below for a link to this page. While generally today an abomination can just mean something offensive, in the old days it was meant to describe a sin that God really found offensive. Perhaps you could say God actually takes this sin personally. So very colorful hyperbolic language here, don't you think? John C. Calhoun and Nullification versus Federal Supremacy. So here's a picture of John C. Calhoun, kind of wild looking dude. And Calhoun introduced nullification legislation in the South Carolina legislature to undo the federal tariffs. This is a huge problem. The Supreme Court had never ruled that any states could overrule or, in quotes, nullify federal laws, even though some states had tried. So Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions that declared the Federal Alien and Sedition Acts null and void. Yes, those things were resolutions that passed in those state legislatures, but was never really tried as such as to whether those resolutions did anything. The Alien and Sedition Acts were found to be unconstitutional, etc., and also did lose the president who got those passed, voted out of office, so, that was taken care of through other ways, the Alien and Sedition Acts. Anyway, the Supreme Court has always ruled, and probably will always rule, that only federal courts have the final say on federal law. After all, it's federal law, and Article 3 of the Constitution says that federal courts handle questions of federal law, or at least they have the last word on issues of federal law. Jackson and his supporters did pass a force bill through Congress, which authorized the use of the military against South Carolina for treason. And, of course, South Carolina's legislature, I guess having a pretty good sense of humor, turned around and nullified that. So, Congress did quickly revise the tariffs to provide relief to South Carolina and defuse the situation. So, basically, it was a big game of chicken, or brinksmanship, if you want to call it that. Congress and the South Carolina legislature said, okay, who's going to give? And Congress gave and said, okay, we'll fix the tariffs, but you've got to stop this nullification stuff, okay? So let's move on. The Second Bank of the United States dies. Remember how I talked about a few minutes ago that Andrew Jackson killed the Second Bank of the United States? He did. It was a huge issue in the Jackson administration. A national bank had been a hot-button issue since Hamilton proposed it in 1791. So the Second Bank of the United States performed well, but Jackson believed it was putting money in the hand of the elite. See the farewell address summary above. Not a summary, a summary. Anyway, Jackson's opponents believed an 1832 vote to recharter the Second Bank of the U.S., which was 4 years ahead of the time that the charter was going to expire in 1836, would cause Jackson to lose popularity and power when he vetoed it because of his opposition to an effective bank. So this was kind of a plan that backfired. So Jackson's opponents said, yeah, let's put this before him, make him look like a real jerk. They were wrong. The voters actually liked Jackson's populist message, which we heard before. Basically, this bank is going to have a monopoly on money and it's going to give money to the fat cats and things like that. So they actually liked that message and supported Jackson's veto. Jackson then moved to destroy the bank even before the 1836 end of its charter. Federal funds were moved to banks that Jackson liked, state banks in democratic states, sometimes called pet banks. So, more on the Second Bank of the United States. From Wikipedia, secondly, the Deposit and Distribution Act of 1836 placed federal revenues in various local banks, derisively named pet banks, across the country. Many of these banks were located in the West. The effect of both policies was to transfer species, remember hard money backed by gold or silver, that's a little note I put in there, anyway, away from the nation's main commercial centers on the East Coast, so not Boston, not New York, not Philadelphia, and not even Washington, D.C., and so with lower monetary reserves in their vaults, major banks and financial institutions on the East Coast had to scale back their loans, which was a major cause of the panic besides the real estate crash. So this was a government policy that had some unintended consequences. I'm sure Jackson didn't want that to happen. Specie Circular. Here's another thing that caused effects that Jackson probably didn't want to happen. So Jackson gave notice that only gold and silver specie, or hard currency, not paper currency, would be accepted as payment for government-owned land. So if you want to buy land for the government, well, better have some gold or better have some silver. So this proclamation was called the Specie Circular, and here we can see the Custom House, all bonds must be paid in specie, and then Mechanics Bank, oh, no specie payments made here. So the problem is you couldn't necessarily get specie from the bank that you worked with, but you had to pay in specie, so maybe you just couldn't pay and you couldn't get what you needed. So the problem meant that the federal government couldn't make nearly as much money from land sales as it otherwise would, because people who'd want to buy land didn't have the hard currency, they just had paper currency. The destruction of the Second Bank of the U.S. and the Specie Circular caused the economic downturn called the Panic of 1837. What was that Panic of 1837? I'm glad you asked. So, from Wikipedia, the Panic of 1837 was a financial crisis in the United States that touched off a major depression, which lasted until the mid-1840s. Profits, prices, and wages went down, unemployment went up, and pessimism abounded. The panic had both domestic and foreign origins. Speculative lending practices in the West, a sharp decline in cotton prices, a collapsing land bubble, international specie flows, and restrictive lending policies in Britain were all factors. On May 10, 1837, banks in New York City suspended specie payments and would no longer redeem commercial paper in specie at full face value. So, despite a brief recovery in 1838, the recession persisted for approximately 7 years. Banks collapsed, businesses failed, prices declined, and thousands of workers lost their job. From 1837 to 1844, deflation in wages and prices was widespread. So that's a real problem when banks that you've borrowed money from, or really that you've lent money to, rather, if you've bought their commercial paper, the idea is when the bonds mature, when things mature, you want to trade it back in and get your nice hard currency. They say, yeah, we can't do that, or at least we can't give you the full value, even though, yeah, we said we were going to. Well, you know what? Tough cookies, can't do it. So here we have a new edition of Macbeth, or the Scottish play, I should say, if you're in the people in the entertainment industry usually don't say Macbeth, they say the Scottish play. But, all right, no credit, huzzah! So that's a way of saying hurrah. Down with the bank. Bear in mind, the creature stirred and has some conscience left by the eternal. We must shake that out of him. Never shake the gory locks at me. Thou canst not say I did it. So they're making fun of Jackson, and so repeal the Treasury Order, specie, blah, blah, blah. I am the ghost of commerce. So what they're saying is he basically killed American commerce with this kind of thing. Oh, and you see a thing about Tammany Hall here. So definitely some problems here. And basically a lot of corruption was involved. And so let's move on. You probably know this, but in case you don't, federal aid was not a consideration in the 1830s, so stimulus payments, etc., weren't considered to end the Panic of 1837 and the resulting recession. So no stimulus, no bailout, nothing like that. Not to mention the point of the Specie Circular was that hard money, money backed by gold, silver, or some other precious commodity, was preferable to fiat currency, money that's backed by nothing but belief the country issuing it will pay its debts. stimulus or bailout, etc. That's much more of a 20th or 21st century fiat currency economic solution than a 19th century hard money solution. So remember, hard money, gold, silver. Fiat currency, green pieces of paper issued by the US government, or whatever colored pieces of paper issued by whatever government. They can print as many of these as they want. It's just backed by good faith in the government that's issuing it. All right. Whigs and Democrats. Jackson's opponents formed the Whig Party in 1833. There were few clear differences between the two parties. There just weren't that many. Both had Northerners and Southerners, for example, so it wasn't split along regional lines. The main difference was the Whigs supported tariffs for internal improvements, but the Democrats believed that tariffs would, in quotes, fatten merchants at working classes' expense. So basically, that was the main thing. It was very Jacksonian, very common person, common man, working class kind of thing that, oh, we don't want tariffs for these fat cats. We just want to have, we just want to keep our money as much as we can, and, we'll build the internal improvements we need, but nothing else. Mostly both parties' agenda was to get votes any way possible, which is pretty much the purpose of any political party or any organization at all, if Machiavelli is to be believed, that the primary purpose of any organization is simply to survive. So, that's the way it normally is in the United States. Politics weren't as polarized as in the early years of the U.S. or as they would be around the Civil War, which would be coming soon, but basically, so they needed to do the same thing as what I showed in my previous video with the John Jackson and Jack Johnson Futurama kind of campaign, is basically both parties are going to support things everybody likes, be against things everybody hates, and then they'll have a few differences on a few issues that people are split on. So that's what they did back then. And so we had the electoral ticket with Henry Clay and Vice President Theodore Frelinghuysen. All right. Hamilton and Clay. So, they were very similar about their ideas about how the federal government should operate, as mentioned in video 34, etc. Both supported a central bank, high tariffs to encourage domestic industry and internal improvements. And in case you notice, I made a mistake here. Very similar. Probably should have just taken out these commas because they're just very similar ideas about the federal government, how the federal government should operate, as mentioned in video 34. So actually just take out this comma. As mentioned in video 34 is still something that you could set off from the rest of the sentence. But I digress. Anyway, both of these guys, Hamilton and Clay, supported a central bank, high tariffs to encourage domestic industry and internal improvements. Modern Republicans are usually pro-business, but do not support tariffs. They're very pro-free trade with other countries and deregulation. They don't like tariffs. They don't like regulations on pretty much anything. They're very big on not raising money for government. They like small government. So raising money for the government is the last thing they want to do. They're very similar to Jackson's Democrats in that regard. Their rhetoric is basically taxes mostly feed the fat cats rather than solving problems. Businesses fix problems using good old market solutions. Whereas more of a Democrat, modern Democrats would be, well, we need to spend money on this to keep our society going. And hey, roads and bridges and schools and things are good things. So that's your difference today, but that was the difference back then, is that mostly Hamilton and Clay supported the central bank, high tariffs, and Jackson and the Democrats hated the idea of a central bank and hated tariffs. So let's move on. Northern versus Southern regional priorities. Now, there was a developing national market economy, but it didn't do away with regional priorities, both political and economic. Obviously, the North was becoming industrialized, and the South was a mass growth of plantation crops, especially cotton. So the South was agricultural, the North was industrial. They had different interests. Even though the regional economies became more interdependent, because if somebody who owned a plantation in the South wanted to buy manufactured goods, they had to buy it from a northern state. Someone in the North needed cotton, perhaps for running a textile mill, they needed to get that from the South. And so the regional economies basically became more interdependent with greater trade between the North, South, West, East, other parts of this country. Especially with tariffs on things coming from outside the country, they had to rely on things that you could obtain within the country. However, slavery was still a huge moral, economic, and political issue in the United States, and that would lead to trouble later. Remember, we're talking 1830s, 1840s. Civil War started in 1861, so happened pretty quickly. The gag rule regarding slavery. Starting in the 1830s, abolitionists lobbied to have anti-slavery resolutions debated by Congress. John Quincy Adams, who became a congressman after his term as president, so in case you're wondering, is that the same guy who was president? Yes, it is, was a key figure in introducing such resolutions. You don't see that today. People don't go back to being representatives or senators after being president, but whatever. Southern representatives successfully introduced gag rules that were procedural rules that automatically tabled such resolutions, meaning that they couldn't be read or debated. So that was just an auto block. You can think of like a block on Facebook or something. Yeah, we're blocking that. Boop. We're not even going to talk about that. So those gag rules were in effect from 1836 to 1844. So that's 8 years of John Quincy Adams and other people introducing these anti-slavery resolutions, and the Southern senators, representatives, etc., just saying, yeah, we can't talk about that procedural rule. Remember, gag rule, that's too bad. All right. Did you find this video useful? If you did, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Neither action costs you anything. You'll be alerted about my new videos. Why? Well, it's simple. YouTube doesn't let me share any ad revenue unless I have 1,000 subscribers and 4,000 hours of view time in a year. While many people are watching these, I don't have 4,000 hours of view time. I also don't have 1,000 subscribers at this time, although I'm getting close, so you could help me by subscribing. Ad money will help me make more videos. And remember, if you saw an ad during this video, please know I did not get any of that ad money. That's what I mean by any of it here in writing. I didn't get any of the ad money, and I won't get any ad money until I have the subscribers and view time that YouTube demands. For the same reasons, you are not only welcome, but encouraged to share links to this video, put in playlists, etc. I gladly read and respond to constructive criticism or suggestions for new videos, so go ahead and contact me if you actually have something constructive to say. But I reserve the right to delete comments such as troll posts or spam. So if you're going to troll, you're going to spam, don't even bother. I'll just block the comments, okay? You can hire me for tutoring. If you are in the San Francisco Bay Area, we can meet in person subject to mask requirements and distancing requirements, etc. And of course, if you're anywhere else in the world and have an internet connection, you can do online tutoring with me. And if you don't have an internet connection, how are you managing to watch this video? All right. Thanks for watching. I am going to give you a little more information if you want to stay tuned, though. Contact me, Facebook, Instagram, email, phone. Facebook, www.facebook.com/Linnaball Tutoring. Instagram, it's instagram.com/John.Linnaball.tutoring. Phone is 415-623-4251. My email is john@johnlinnaball.com. My website is www.johnlinnaball.com or www.johnlinnaballtutoring.com. They both take you to the same site. Testpreparation.locals.com is my nifty locals.com site. Why not go and join up? lbry.tv, that's another place where you can find these videos. And from what I understand, there's less advertising and a little less BS than some other platforms. Mail, if you want to actually send me postal mail, you can mail me at John Linnaball Tutoring, 1859 Powell Street, number 109, San Francisco, California, 94133. And with that, I'm out of here. Have a nice day, night, whatever time of day it is there. Thanks. Bye-bye.